When performance fails, understanding default in commercial contracts. As we move forward from timelines and cure periods, we now step into the reality of what happens when a party does not perform. Even with a well-drafted contract and properly managed timelines, not every transaction closes. When one party fails to meet their obligations, the contract enters the stage of default and potential breach. Default occurs when a party does not fulfill a contractual obligation within the required timeframe. This ties directly to the timelines discussed in Section 3.1. Once a deadline is missed and not cured, the contract moves from performance into enforcement. Under ARS, paragraph 32 to 2153, misrepresentation, dishonesty, or failure to comply with contractual obligations can result in disciplinary action for licensees. This reinforces that agents must understand not only how to create contracts, but how to navigate them when things go wrong. Material versus minor breach, why the difference matters. Not all breaches are equal. A material breach is a failure that goes to the heart of the contract, while a minor breach involves less significant issues that may not justify termination. For example, a buyer failing to close on the agreed closing date is typically considered a material breach. On the other hand, a minor delay in delivering a document may not justify canceling the contract. This distinction is critical because it determines what remedies are available. Courts often look at whether the breach significantly impacted the purpose of the contract when deciding how to enforce it. Buyer default versus seller default, different consequences. Commercial contracts typically outline specific remedies depending on which party defaults. If the buyer defaults, the most common remedy is forfeiture of earnest money as liquidated damages. This allows the seller to retain the deposit without having to prove actual damages. For example, a buyer under contract for an industrial property in Phoenix fails to close after the due diligence period. The seller may retain the earnest money as compensation for the failed transaction. If the seller defaults, the buyer may have the right to pursue specific performance or damages. Specific performance is a legal remedy that requires the seller to complete the transaction as agreed. This is more common in real estate because each property is considered unique. For example, if a seller attempts to back out of a deal after accepting a contract, the buyer may seek a court order requiring the seller to proceed with the sale. Liquidated damages, predetermined consequences. Liquidated damages are a pre-agreed amount of compensation specified in the contract, typically tied to the earnest money deposit. This provision simplifies disputes by eliminating the need to prove actual damages. Instead, the parties agree in advance on what will happen if the buyer defaults. However, liquidated damages must be reasonable and not punitive. Courts may refuse to enforce them if they are excessive or unfair. This concept ties into broader contract law principles and reinforces the importance of drafting clear and balanced agreements. Specific performance, forcing the deal to close. Specific performance is one of the most powerful remedies available in real estate transactions. Because real property is unique, monetary damages may not fully compensate a buyer for losing a specific property. Arizona case law, including Jennings v. Lee, highlights the importance of fiduciary duties and full disclosure, which can play a role in disputes involving specific performance. For example, if a seller agrees to sell a high-value commercial property in Scottsdale and later refuses to close, the buyer may seek specific performance to enforce the contract. However, this remedy requires court involvement and can be time-consuming and expensive. Rescission and mutual release, ending the contract. Cleanly. Not all disputes end in litigation. In many cases, the parties may agree to rescind the contract and release each other from obligations. Rescission returns both parties to their original positions, often involving the return of earnest money. For example, during a transaction for a retail center in Chandler, both parties may agree to cancel the contract due to financing challenges and sign a mutual release. This allows both parties to move on without further liability. This option is often the most practical solution when both parties recognize that the transaction cannot proceed. Dispute resolution, avoiding court, when possible. Many commercial contracts include dispute resolution provisions, such as mediation or arbitration. Mediation allows the parties to negotiate a resolution with the help of a neutral third party, while arbitration involves a binding decision made by an arbitrator. These methods are often faster and less expensive than litigation, making them a preferred option in many commercial disputes. This ties back to the importance of understanding contract terms at the beginning of the transaction, because those terms will control how disputes are handled later. Agent responsibilities. During a dispute. When a contract begins to break down, the agent's role becomes even more critical. Agents must remain neutral, communicate clearly, and avoid providing legal advice beyond their scope. Under AAC R4281101, agents must exercise reasonable care and avoid misrepresentation. They should also recommend that clients seek legal counsel when disputes arise. For example, if a dispute over earnest money escalates, the agent should not attempt to interpret legal rights, but should direct the parties to attorneys or escrow professionals. This protects both the client and the agent from potential liability. Real-world scenario when default leads to litigation. N. Consider a buyer under contract for a multifamily property in Mesa. After the due diligence period expires, the buyer decides not to proceed due to market concerns, but has no contractual right to cancel. The seller refuses to release the earnest money, and the dispute escalates. The buyer claims misrepresentation, while the seller claims breach. This situation may ultimately be resolved through mediation, arbitration, or court action, depending on the contract terms. This example shows how quickly a transaction can shift from negotiation to enforcement when performance fails. Connecting this section to the bigger picture. This section represents the turning point in the contract lifecycle. We have moved from performance into enforcement, where the strength of the contract is tested. Understanding default, breach, and remedies allows agents to guide clients through difficult situations while minimizing risk. As we move into the next section, we will explore closing and final execution, where successful transactions come together and all contractual obligations are fulfilled. This is the final stage where everything we have learned is brought to completion. Online discussion. What is the difference between a material breach and a minor breach? Answer. A material breach significantly impacts the contract and may justify termination, while a minor breach involves less critical issues that may not justify canceling the contract. What is the most common remedy for buyer default in a commercial transaction? Answer. The most common remedy is forfeiture of earnest money as liquidated damages. Why is specific performance commonly used in real estate disputes? Answer. Because real property is unique, and monetary damages may not adequately compensate a buyer for losing a specific property.